Okay, this is the second one of these. This is now the falsification principle. Now, the falsification principle obviously arose as a direct criticism of the verification principle, which I just discussed. It principally was started by Karl Popper, who was somewhat personally involved with the Vienna Circle, namely because he wasn't allowed to be a member of the organisation. And what he was particularly interested in was the main assertion that to uphold good scientific language, what you required was verification. And what he actually said is that rather than this being good science, this was in fact bad science. And what is good science is not knowing the method of verification, but in fact knowing the method of falsification. Now this is something which we could actually use Darwin to support. At the end of Origin of the Species, Darwin says, if I can find any evidence to count against it, then I will know that my theory is wrong, just a singular piece of evidence. But because I can find no evidence, I have to conclude that to date I am right. Similarly with Einstein's theory of gravity. It's not knowing what needs to take place to know whether it is true, it's knowing what would take place to be false. So if I drop the pen and it does not plummet to the ground, then I will know that the theory of gravity is in fact false. It is falsifiable. So what this means is a clear distinction. We're not saying that it has to have been falsified, because that would be ridiculous. What we're saying is that we know how it can be falsified. So it is, again, the method of falsification as opposed to verification. And it also deals with the problem with positive universals. So as we looked at before, if we say all metals expand when heated, or the example Popper uses about black ravens, positive universals are no problem when it comes to the falsification principle. So for instance, do we know how to prove the statement false, that all metals expand when heated? Well, yes, by when we test. If one of them does not expand, then we'll know that we'll have to change that scientific theory. So it's rather straightforward. Now, Popper you can particularly use to criticise the verification principle, but it doesn't work as easy when it comes to just applying it generally to religious language, because Popper isn't interested in religious language. What he's interested in scientific language and upholding it. So it's really turning to Flew where we get the more application towards religious language. Now, Flew gives us what we call the university debate. Now, it's called the university debate solely because the people who were involved in it were all university lecturers or professors. So the first person is Anthony Flew. Now, Anthony Flew is a supporter of Popper and his principle. And what he used was John Wisdom's parable of the gardener. Now, there are many different versions of this, but to summarise, you have two explorers in a jungle, and they come across a clearing, and one says to the other, I imagine that a gardener must have made this. It's far too designed, it's far too looked after. Someone must be caring for it. And the other chap says, no, I don't think so, I think it's just natural. It's just a peculiarity. This little clearing is the way that it is. But it's natural that there isn't any design to it. And so they test it. And they camp out and they have a look to see if anyone turns up. No one turns up. So rather than the person who believed that there was a gardener say, actually, I'm wrong, you're right, he does something which Flew calls qualification. He qualifies it. He says, it's because the gardener is invisible. And so they do lots of different tests. They put electric fence up, they get bloodhounds, and each stage he qualifies it further. So not only is this gardener an invisible gardener, this gardener is in fact an intangible gardener. It's senseless, scentless, it can move through walls and electric fences. It cannot be picked up by any different detection, which leaves the person who doesn't believe the gardener to suggest, what's the difference between that gardener, an invisible, intangible, scentless gardener, to no gardener at all? And he says what happens is that the idea dies the death of 1,000 qualifications. Because what you do when you further qualify and justify it is you're reducing it further and further. Now, what Flew then applies this to religious languages says that this is the case for the religious believer. The religious believer, and this is the crucial bit, will never accept any evidence that they are wrong. What they will do when presented with evidence is qualify it further. They will say, it's because of this, it's because of that. So, case in point, the problem of evil. For many people, the problem of evil is a very strong argument not to believe in an omnipotent, benevolent God. Perhaps omnipotent, perhaps benevolent, but not both. But that's not true for the theist. The theist qualifies their belief. So they still believe God is loving, and they say, it's because of this, it's because of that. And the very ultimate cop-out is by saying, ultimately, God's outside of our understanding, we do not know. Now, that's Flew's claim, that firstly, falsification is the correct way in which we ascribe meaning. But when we apply it to religious language and to believers, it's because the language which they used, whilst it may be falsifiable in principle, and maybe other people will find it falsifiable like atheists, but for the believer, they will never find it falsifiable. Therefore, we will reduce the credibility and the actual meaning of that section, of that sentence. Sorry. Now, the debate then was picked up by R.M. Herr, and R.M. Herr gives us his own parable, and this is the parable of the insane university student, and his idea is called Bliks. That's B-L-I-K-S. Now, with his Bliks, what he said is that, effectively, every single person has something which is unfalsifiable. This isn't unique to religious language, or religious believers. Everyone has one. And in his case, he had an insane university student. And what he is insane is that he believes that his university dons, his professors, are trying to kill him. It doesn't matter what evidence to the contrary, how nice and kindly and gentle his dons are, he will not accept it. And what he said is, in this case, we've got a right Blik and a wrong Blik. So obviously, this man is insane, he's wrong. And the idea is that it's not a question of saying whether something's meaningful or not meaningful, because ultimately there are all things in our life that we won't falsify. I'll pause it there because I'm just